The heat that August afternoon pressed down on the fairgrounds like a hand held flat against the earth, and beneath the sagging canvas of the pavilion, where the water committee had called its emergency meeting, 400 people sat sweating in a silence so heavy you could hear the flies working the rafters. At the front stood a man in a pale linen suit that had not wilted, holding a contract, and at the back, near the open door where the only breath of air came in, stood a small, brown-armed woman of 34 in a faded work dress, and every eye in that pavilion, whether it would admit it or not, was fixed on her. The whole county's summer, its gardens, its canned larders, its winter, hung on what she would say next. She had not asked for that power. She had bought 3 acres of scrub-bottom land with almost every dollar she owned, and the county had laughed at her for it for 2 years running. Now the county could not eat without her. But you should understand that the real answer to what she would say had been written long before that afternoon, written in the dark of the soil across 2 seasons of stooped labor, and to understand it you have to go back to the spring she first came down the river road with everything she owned in a borrowed wagon. Her name was Della Mott, and she came into the Valley of Coldwater on a gray morning in the March of the 2nd year of the dry cycle, though nobody yet called it a drought because the reservoir was still high and the wells still gave sweet water, and men still spoke of the dryness as a run of bad luck that would break with the next good rain. She was a widow, though only barely. Married 11 months and widowed at 32 when her husband took a fever in a lumber camp 3 states east, and she had come west with the small sum his death had settled on her, $412, looking for land she could afford. What she could afford was not much. The Valley of Coldwater ran to good broad farms along the creek, worked by families 3 generations deep, and those farms were not for sale to a stranger, and would not have been within her reach if they were. What was for sale was a strip of low ground. At the far bend of the creek, 3 acres and a quarter, land the old Pruitt family had let go for taxes, because it flooded in a wet spring and baked to brick in a dry one. Land nobody wanted because it lay in the shadow of the bluff and got its sun late and lost it early. She paid $310 for it, and the tumble-down 2-room house that stood on it, and she had $102 left to feed herself, until something grew. The men at the land office did not trouble to hide their amusement. There was a fellow there named Colton Reeve, agent for the Coldwater Land and Irrigation Consortium, a smooth, heavy man who wore a linen suit even in March and smelled of bay rum, and he watched her sign the papers with the indulgent patience of a man watching a child stack blocks that must soon fall. When she had finished, he offered, in a voice warm as fresh milk, to take the 3 acres off her hands for $275. $35 less than she had paid, and he called it a kindness. A woman alone, he said, has no business fighting bottomland. Save yourself the heartbreak. She looked at him a moment with steady dark eyes and said, "Only I believe I will keep it, thank you." He smiled and gave her his card, and said the offer stood, and he believed it would not be long before she came crawling to take it, because you must know that the consortium wanted that whole bend of the creek. Reeves' people had been buying up the low ground along the water for 3 years, quietly, parcel by parcel, and they had a plan to dam the creek at the Narrows and sell irrigation shares to the whole valley. And Della's 3 acres and a quarter sat square in the flood line of the pond they meant to raise. Every other holder along the bend had sold. She was the last, and she did not know it yet, and that ignorance was the only thing that kept her price honest. Because if she had known how badly they wanted it, she might have held out for money. And money was not what the land wanted from her. She spent her first weeks on that ground, learning its faults the way you learn the faults of a hard master. By being hurt, the soil at the top of the strip was thin and stony, and dried to dust that blew off in the afternoon wind. The bottom third, nearest the creek, held water so long in the low spots that seed rotted. The bluff stole 2 hours of morning sun. The neighbors, when they passed on the river road, looked at the lone woman turning that ground with a borrowed mule, and shook their heads and the boldest of them, a big, loud, prosperous man named Harlan Buford, who farmed the best 200 acres in the valley and never let you forget it, stopped his buggy one morning to tell her plainly that she was throwing good sweat after bad money. "Nobody's made a nickel off Pruitt Bottom in 40 years, he said, laughing so that his whole chest shook. "You'd do better to plant that $100 in the bank and marry a man with dry ground." She leaned on her hoe and let him laugh, and said nothing, and when he had driven on, she went back to work, because there was nothing else to do and no one else to do it. That first season, she made every mistake the ground could teach her. She planted the way she had seen it done back east, in long straight rows of a single crop. Corn on the top ground because corn was money, and the corn came up thin and yellow and burned in the July heat before it ever tasseled. She planted beans in the bottom, and the bottom drowned them in a May rain, and then baked them when the rain quit. By the middle of that first summer she had turned $102 into 11, and she sat on the sagging step of her house one evening with her hands cracked open and bleeding at the knuckles, and did the arithmetic of her ruin. $11, a dead corn crop, a drowned bean patch, no feed for a winter she would not be able to buy her way through. She had come to believe what every man in the valley already believed, that she had been a fool, and she put her face in her ruined hands and let herself for the first time since the lumber camp fever come to the very edge of weeping. What stopped her was a small green thing. In the corner of the bottom ground where the bean rows had drowned, in a low seep where the creek kept the soil damp all summer, a volunteer squash had come up from a seed she had never planted, a seed that must have ridden in on the flood mud, and it had spread its broad leaves over the wet corner and set 3 heavy yellow fruits, thriving in the exact spot that had killed everything she chose to grow there. She knelt in the dusk and put her hand on one of the warm gourds, and understood dimly and for the first time that she had spent a whole season telling the land what it must do, and never once asking it what it wished to do. The wet corner wanted to be wet, the stony top wanted something with a deep, dry root. She had been fighting the ground instead of reading it. She did not solve anything that night, but she stopped weeping, and she slept, and in the morning she began to watch. It was watching that brought the old woman to her fence. Her nearest neighbor to the north was a widow named Yetta Kessler, who had come from the old country 40 years before and outlived a husband and 2 grown sons, and now lived alone with a milk goat and a garden that was, everyone agreed, the strangest and the finest in the valley. A wild-seeming tangle of things grown together that nonetheless fed her the year around and left her enough to sell. The valley half feared old Yetta, for she spoke little and kept to herself, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel your thoughts were transparent, and the children said she could talk to plants. She had watched Della all that first ruinous season without a word, but on a morning in the early fall, when Della was down on her knees studying that volunteer squash, and the wet corner where it grew, Yetta came to the low fence between their grounds and leaned her arms on it and spoke. "You have found out the first thing," she said. Her voice was soft and bent with the shapes of another tongue. "You have found out that the field is not a page you write upon. It is a letter already written, and you must learn to read the hand." Della looked up at her. "I don't know how to read it," she said. Yetta nodded slowly, as if this were the correct and hopeful answer. "Nobody knows," she said. "You do not learn it in a year. But I will tell you what my grandmother told me, and it is the whole of it. So listen. The ground remembers everything the farmer forgets. It remembers the water that came and the water that did not. It remembers the roots that fed it and the roots that starved it. And it will tell you all of this, but it tells you in a whisper, and only once. So you must be very quiet, and you must be there to hear." She reached into her apron and brought out a small cloth bag, heavy with seed, and she pressed it into Della's hands over the fence. "These are from my garden," she said. "Many kinds, mixed together, the way they grow at home. Do not plant them in rows. Plant them where each one wants to be, and let them help one another as neighbors do, and watch. That is your whole schooling. Watch." Then she turned and went back to her goat, and Della stood holding the bag of mixed seed as if it were the first coin of a fortune. There is a boy I must tell you about too, for he came into the story that same fall and did not leave it. His name was Paytasaro, and he was 10 years old and the youngest of the 7 children of the poorest family in the valley, tenant farmers on Harlan Buford's back 40, who paid their rent and labor and never had 2 coins to knock together. Pate was a quiet boy, so quiet the schoolmaster thought him simple, though he was not simple at all, only watchful, a boy who noticed things and kept them. He had taken to slipping down the river road to Della's fence to watch her work, first from a distance and then closer. And one afternoon he climbed over the fence without a word, and picked up the second hoe and began to chop weeds from the squash hill as if he had been hired to it. She did not send him home. They worked the rest of that day in silence, and when the light failed she gave him a plate of the volunteer squash fried in the last of her lard, and he ate it slowly and gravely, and said it was the best thing he had eaten in his life, which, given the sour larder, may well have been true. He came back the next day, and the next, and he stayed. He named things. He named the milk goat. Yetta gave her Duchess. He named the hens. He was the first living soul in the Valley of Coldwater to look at what Della Mott was doing and see sense in it instead of folly. And on the long cold days of that first winter, when the 2 of them mended fence and hauled creek mud and turned the beds, his solemn company was the only thing that stood between her and the whole weight of being. As the valley called it, a woman alone, that winter she planned by lamplight. She had walked every foot of her 3 acres and 100 times, and she had made a map of it, not of what she wished to grow, but of what the ground itself was telling her it would carry. The wet corner near the creek, a half-acre, wanted squash and melon, and the greedy cucumbers, and the deep-drinking celery, things that never minded wet feet. The stony-topped ground, an acre, where the corn had burned, wanted the dry-rooted things that hunt water deep, the tomatoes and the peppers and the herbs and the beans that would climb, and above all, it wanted to be shaded low against the sun that baked it. So she planned to grow tall sunflowers and corn along its west edge as a living wall to break the afternoon glare. The middle ground, the acre, and 3/4 between, was good honest loam that wanted only care and rotation, and there she meant to put the roots and the greens and the heavy feeders. And through all of it she would plant, the way Yetta had told her, not in the lonely rows of a single crop where a pest that loves one thing can march the length of the row and eat the year, but in mingled beds where beans fed the soil for the corn, and the corn held up the beans and the squash leaves shaded the ground so the water did not flee. 3 sisters, and a dozen cousins besides, every plant, a neighbor to another. It was a truck patch only that, 3 acres of vegetables such as a family might keep for its own table, and the Valley of Coldwater, which measured a man by the acres of corn and wheat he could throw against the market, thought a truck patch the smallest and softest kind of farming there was, fit for a widow and not much more. The spring of the 3rd year she planted her mingled beds, and Pate helped her, and old Yetta came sometimes to the fence to look and to say a soft word, and Harlan Buford drove by on the road and laughed to see the crazy tangled garden going in where honest rows should be. 3 acres of salad, he called it. Reeve the land agent came too, in April, in a fresh linen suit, and stood at her fence and made his offer again, higher this time, $350, more than she had paid, and again, he called it a kindness to a woman who could not hope to make that bottom pay. She was on her knees in the wet corner setting melon seed when he made it, and she did not stop working, and she said, "I believe I will keep it, thank you." Reeve's warm smile thinned for just a moment, the first crack in it she had seen, and he said, in a voice a shade colder, "You may not always have the choice, Mrs. Mott." And then he caught himself, and warned again, and tipped his hat and went. She did not think much of the threat. She should have. But she had a garden to plant, and the garden was teaching her at last to hear it. And she had no ears to spare for a man in a clean suit. Through that third summer, the garden did what the land had been trying to tell her all along it could do. In the wet corner, the squash and melons ran riot over ground that had drowned every row crop she ever set there, and their broad leaves lay a living roof over the soil, so that even in the July heat, the earth beneath them stayed cool and damp when every open field in the valley was cracking. On the stony top, the wall of sunflowers and corn broke the afternoon sun, and in their shade the tomatoes set fruit that did not scald, and the deep bean roots found water 2 feet down that the shallow corn of the valley could never reach. The mingled beds fed themselves. Where Buford and the other big farmers hauled water and dusted poison and fought the ground for every ear, Della's 3 acres held their own moisture like a sponge and threw up more food than she and Pate could pick, and she began, quietly, without a word to anyone, to understand that she had stumbled onto something the whole rich valley had forgotten in its rush to plant one great crop and sell it. She was growing food that did not care so much whether it rained. She did not shout it. She banked it the way old Yetta banked a coal and ash, to keep the fire through the night, low and hidden and alive. And she went on letting the valley pity her. The first man from outside to see the truth of it was a cook. His name was Amos Quint, and he ran the dining car kitchen for the railroad that stopped twice a week at the cold water depot to take on water. And he had grown weary of the wilted, poison-dusted produce the valley farms sold him. He heard from the depot agent that the crazy widow at the creek bend was growing something different, and one August morning he walked out the river road and stood at Della's fence and looked a long time at her heavy-laden mingled beds, and then he asked to taste a tomato. She handed him one warm off the vine. He bit it standing there, and the juice ran down his wrist, and he closed his eyes. He bought everything she could cut that week, and he paid her a price per crate near double what the valley farms got at market, because his was food that had never been scalded or drowned or dusted, and it tasted, he said, like food was supposed to taste. He came every week the railroad ran, and he told the other cooks down the line, and by the end of that third summer, Della Maud was selling 3 acres of vegetables for more clear money than Harlan Buford cleared off his 200 acres of corn, and almost nobody in the valley knew it. Because she paid her debts quietly, and dressed the same, and let them go on laughing. She banked it. The coal glowed under the ash. Then the dry cycle, which the valley had kept calling a run of bad luck, closed its hand at last, and the 4th year came in like the open door of a furnace. It did not rain in April. It did not rain in May. The reservoir behind the consortium's new dam at the Narrows, the dam they had raised on all that bottomland. They bought up cheap, dropped, and the irrigation shares Reeve had sold the valley for good money, began to run dry in the ditches. By June, the creek itself was a chain of shrinking pools. The great corn and wheat fields of Coldwater, all those honest single crops in their honest single rows, stood and yellowed and curled and died in the field, 10,000 acres of them, because a field of one thirsty crop in a drought is 10,000 mouths all screaming for the same water at the same moment, and there was no water. The valley that had measured itself by its bushels watched its bushels burn. And down at the creek bend on 3 acres and a quarter of scorned bottom, Della Maud's mingled garden, its soil, roofed in leaf and fed by roots that ran deep and dew that gathered under the shade, went on bearing. It bore less than in a wet year, but it bore when nothing else in the valley bore at all. And there is a mathematics of a starving country that is very simple, which is that a little food where there is none is worth more than all the gold in the bank. And slowly, then quickly, the whole valley of Coldwater came to understand where the only food for miles was still growing. Colton Reeve understood it first and worst, because Reeve had lost more than a garden. The consortium's whole fortune was staked on selling water it no longer had, and its irrigation shares were now waste paper. And the men who owned the consortium wanted a new thing to sell to a desperate valley. And Reeve, casting about, saw the one green patch left in a brown country, and understood that Delamotte was no longer a woman he could buy for pocket money. She was the last food in Coldwater, and food in a famine is the most valuable thing on earth. He came to her fence in the last week of June, and the warmth was still in his voice, but there was hunger under it now. "Mrs. Mott," he said, "you have done wonderfully, truly, and it grieves me that I ever doubted you. The consortium wishes to buy your operation entire, the land, the crop, the method, all of it, and to make you a rich woman." He named a sum that made her breath catch. $2,000, more money than she had ever thought to hold. She looked at the brown dead valley and at her green beds, and she said, "And what would the consortium do with it?" Reeve smiled. "Feed the valley," he said. "At a fair price." She said, "At whatever price a starving man will pay." Reeve's smile did not move, but something behind it did. "Business is business," he said softly. She said, "I believe I will keep it. Thank you." She turned back to her picking, and this time Reeve did not tip his hat. This time he went away white about the mouth, and the threats began. They came the way such threats always come, sideways and deniable. A word went round the valley, whispered at the store and the mill, that the widow Mott's vegetables were unclean, that she watered them from a stagnant seep and they would make a body sick, that a family 2 ridges over had taken a flux from her melons. It was a lie, but a lie travels fast in a frightened country, and for 2 weeks the valley half believed it and stayed away, and Amos Quint, the railroad cook, was the only soul buying, and Della watched food she could not sell begin to spoil in the heat, and did her grim arithmetic again, and wondered if a lie could starve her out where the land never had. Then came a man from the county in a stiff collar to tell her that a truck patch on flood ground might be found in violation of a health ordinance nobody had ever heard of, and that the matter could be made to go away if she were to lease her operation to a responsible party, and she understood, without his saying it, whose party that was. She said, "I have broken no law," and she showed him her clean beds and her clean water, hauled by hand from the deepest pool, and he went away with nothing. But she knew the hand behind him, and knew it would close again. It was Pete who caught the spy. The boy had the run of the creek bank now, and he had noticed for a week a man he did not know lying up in the willow scrub across the water with a spyglass counting. And he came and told her, solemn as ever, "There is a man over the creek writing in a book how many crates you cut." She did not let on that she knew, but she began to keep 2 counts, the true one and a false one. She spoke aloud for the willows to hear, and she waited, because being watched, she had learned, was only useful to the watcher so long as the watched did not know. The one who broke first was Harlan Buford, and there is a hard justice in that, for Buford had laughed loudest and lost most. His 200 acres of corn were 200 acres of gray stalks. His cattle were bones. Well, his 7 tenant families, the sorrows among them, were down to boiling weeds, and it was little Pete's own mother, gaunt and shamed, who at last sent the boy to ask whether the widow might spare food they could not pay for, and it was Buford himself who came behind the boy, hat literally in his hands, the great chest fallen in, to stand at the fence where he had laughed and to say, "I have no money that is worth anything, and I have children on my ground who are hungry, and I mocked you, and I have no right to ask, but I am asking." Della looked at the man a long moment. She had every right in the world to name a price that would have taken his 200 acres, and Reeve would have named exactly that. She said, "You have hands, and so do your tenants. Come and pick, and take 1/3 of what you pick to feed your people, and we will call the rest my wage for teaching you how it is done." Buford wept, a big man weeping in the dust, and the next morning he came with his tenant families, and they picked, and they ate, and it was the first food his children had had in a week, and the word of it ran through the valley faster than any lie that the widow Mott was feeding folk for their labor and asking almost nothing. And so the valley came to her, family by family, the very people who had laughed, and she set them all to the same bargain, Come and work the beds and haul the water, and learn the method, and take a share to feed your household, and leave a share for the town. And by that plan, 60 acres and a quarter, worked now by 200 hands, where before there had been two, threw up food enough that the town of Coldwater set up a common table in the church basement and fed, before that dry summer was done, upward of 15,000 meals to every soul in the valley, who was hungry, which was very nearly every soul there was. She could have sold it for gold. She fed them for labor, and for the promise that next spring they would plant their own ground the way the land wished to be planted, in mingled beds that did not fear the sun. The coal she had banked so long she now raked open, and warmed the whole valley at it. Which is how they all came to be in the fairgrounds pavilion, that oven of an August afternoon, 400 of them sweating in silence, because Colton Reeve had made one last play. The consortium, he announced from the front in his uncrumpled linen, had filed to condemn the creek bend under a public necessity, seeing as it was now the sole food source of the county, and to place its operation under responsible management, meaning theirs, meaning that the food would be sold at whatever a starving valley would pay. And he had brought a contract and a county man to bless it, and he asked the widow Mott to come forward and sign over her land for the good of all, and be paid handsomely. And Della Mott walked forward from the door, where the only air was small and brown and calm, and she did not take the pen. She turned to the 400, and she said quietly, so that they had to hush to hear her, "He calls it public necessity. He counted my crates from the willows with a spyglass, and a boy caught him at it, and I gave the willows a false number 2 weeks running. And here in his contract is that false number written as the value of my land. Ask him how he came to know a figure I never sold and never spoke to any honest man. Ask him whose necessity this serves." Reeve went the color of ash, for the number was there in his own contract, in his own hand the counted not bought figure, and it damned him as plainly as a confession, and a low sound went through the pavilion like wind before rain. Then Della said, "I will not sell this land to any man who means to sell hungry people their supper. I will keep it. And any family in this valley that will bring its hands to the creek may bring them, and eat and learn, and next year grow its own, and that is my whole answer, thank you." And the valley took off its hats. It happened all at once. The way she had learned things in that country happened, slow, and then all at once, 400 people rising in that stifling pavilion, and Harlan Buford loudest of all, and Colton Reeve gathering his damning contract and walking out through the crowd that would not part for him kindly, out of the pavilion. Before the summer was done, out of the valley of Coldwater altogether, his consortium broken on its dry dam and its dead shares, and its own greedy overreach, defeated not by money and not by law, but by a woman who would not sell what could not honestly be sold. The rains came in the last week of September, a soft gray 3-day rain that the ground drank like a man too long in the desert, and the dead fields greened faintly at the roots, and the creek filled, and the reservoir behind the broken dam rose slow and clean. That next spring the whole valley planted in mingled beds, and old Yetta Kessler, who had said almost nothing through the entire year, came down to the creek bend to see Della's ground turned once more, and she leaned on the low fence as she had that first ruinous fall, and she watched Della and Pate, taller now, setting melon seed in the wet corner. "You heard it," Yetta said softly. "The field. You learned to be quiet, and you heard what it said, and then you did a harder thing than most who hear it ever do." She looked at the green valley and at the woman they had once dismissed as a widow, alone on worthless ground, a woman now who was the most respected soul in the county and no longer alone, at all. A jury. "You kept your ears open when you were poor," Yetta said, "and you kept your hand open when you were rich. And that, child, is the whole of the schooling. My grandmother could not finish teaching me." She reached over the fence and pressed a small warm melon into Della's hands, the first of the year, and Della held it the way she had once held a bag of mixed seed, like the first coin of a fortune she had never doubted was there, waiting in the ground, whispering, only asking that someone be quiet enough and brave enough to listen.
Mais il y en aura peut-être qu'un qui sera vu ou il y en aura peut-être aucun qui sera vu. Mais il faut y aller, voilà, il faut y aller, il faut se dire que putain demain tout peut s'arrêter et allez, vas-y, on s'en fout, on y va. Voilà. J'arrive pas à tout suivre les copains. Avec plaisir Micha. Franchement, c'est très dur d'être sur les réseaux, de publier régulièrement, ça je l'ai lu. Ce n'était pas plus simple d'avoir des viewers à l'époque, ça partait moins dans tous les sens, c'était plus concentré gaming. Par contre, ça je suis d'accord avec toi Teddy. Maintenant, on a de tout et n'importe quoi. Heu Même si c'est pas en soi, voilà, ça donne la chance à tout le monde, de pouvoir faire des streams, hein. Tu de tout, t'as de tout. On n'est plus sur du gaming pur, c'est pas mal aussi. Mais, est-ce que c'est bien? Est-ce que c'est pas bien? Je sais pas. Tu pas d'accord quand il a dit qu'avant c'était plus simple? OK, mais t'as le droit de ne pas être d'accord avec, avec Teddy, hein. Est-ce que tu peux m'envoyer l'adresse?